Well, Dr. Warren Staples, now you're with RMIT, which is in Victoria, and you're a specialist in corporate governance, business ethics. Well, there's a challenging field, if ever there was one. A thing called CSR, you can tell us what that is in a second, and business and government relations. And welcome to Global Travel Media.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, look, it's been a very, very interesting sort of, one could say a couple of weeks, really, but probably if one said about 12 months in terms of Virgin Australia. And I've been watching it from the travel perspective, being a bit of a specialist in aviation and cruising and stuff like that in the media. And it's been very, very interesting. But you're a specialist in this space. And, it's culminated now with Paul Scurrah departing Virgin Australia and Jane Herdlicker taking over and so on. So what's your perception of what's been going on here from the moment of the sale, I suppose, and Deloitte's getting involved and how it all came about? You're the guru. Give us your story.
Well, look, I mean, Virgin is an entity that's always been kind of dominated by its major shareholders. And obviously it had Singapore Airlines and Etihad, and then the two major Chinese conglomerates. And they liked Virgin because what it enabled them to do was it enabled them to bring passengers and customers to Australia and then flick them on to the kind of places that we'd all love to see in Australia, like the Barrier Reef, Northwest, WA, etc., etc. So it was a real strategic thing for them, but the business hadn't made money for 10 years.
Yeah. And
it hadn't been very well capitalised. And I would argue that was almost by design, that they didn't really want it, paying a lot of tax in Australia. And there were issues of transparency around the profit share between those major shareholders. But it then fell into administration, and we've had Deloitte step in.
Can we go back for a second? So it kicked off as Pacific Blue, didn't it? With Brett Godfrey and what's his name? Can't remember the name of the other guy now, who's an accountant and so on. And they kicked it off, and it was very much a low-cost thing. It was a sort of seat of the pants, wasn't it? It was at the time when, Impulse, Ansett, all that sort of stuff happened. Qantas was there looking as if it was going to become the sole carrier. Then there was Impulse, and all of a sudden, Virgin Blue. And I do remember the story of Brett Godfrey working in London, and I think what happened was that he'd come up with this plan for Virgin Blue a number of years earlier, and he pitched it to Richard Branson and been told, no, I'm not interested. Then all of a sudden, Branson came to Australia, saw what was going on. He called Brett Godfrey and said, Rob Sherrard it was, and he called Brett Godfrey to his office and said, hey, listen, have you got that plan for that airline in Australia? And basically, there was the money, off you go. So this cheap as chips, and that's what it was. It was cheap as chips, the first real low-cost carrier that launched in Australia. So a long time since then, and back to you now on what's happened now with Virgin Australia.
Well, I think that's really interesting background, because there was this perception a little bit, forgetting some of that history, that Branson had really initiated it, but actually he'd been talked into it by Australian business people. And, even in those days, it became pretty dominated by the major shareholders. So it then, moved forward to have these major four, with Branson as a minor shareholder, still receiving branding royalties, and then it hit administration, right, under Paul Scurrah, who had only been in the seat of CEO for, I think, less than a year at the time, and Deloitte and Vaughan Strawbridge.
Let me ask you a question again. I'm sorry to cut you across you. So going into administration, I mean, okay, the whole scenario around COVID and all that sort of stuff wasn't a wonderful place to be in any case. But do you think, and knowing the way that you've thought about this extensively, that the administration was partly caused? I mean, John Borghetti, ex-Qantas and so on, moved across, left Qantas because of a whole load of scenarios. We won't go into those. I mean, in terms of he was going to be a successor to the CEO there. And so on. And then he got across to Virgin Australia, and then seemed to then set up a Virgin Australia that was a bit of a sort of mirror image, if you like, of Qantas, a you know, a full service carrier offering all the business class seats, the lounges, all that sort of stuff. Do you think that was sustainable, or was it so difficult that once COVID came along and numbers started dropping, all that sort of stuff, it couldn't be kept going?
I don't think Virgin have ever had a sustainable strategy for them. I mean, I think if you go back to Virgin Blue, they didn't quite get it right then. You know, it was post September 11, and the price-based war they entered into was part of the demise of Ansett, but I don't think it was ever sustainable for them. And then obviously they shifted under Borghetti, and people have suggested that that was part of a competition between him and Alwyn-Jones, and that that was personally driven. I don't know whether that was true, but I don't think, again, that they got the strategy right. And I think if we reflect on COVID, that I don't know that this, what I think is going to be the lowest cost strategy of Hood Liquor and, you know, the Virgin 2.0, I'm not sure that's a sustainable strategy for them also. So I think they've always had problems settling on a strategy that is long-term and sustainable.
So if we go back a step as well, I mean, we've got the whole scenario around Deloitte's undertaking the administration and so on. And I mean, rightly or wrongly, my impression was that they wanted to sell it to Bain from the beginning. And they went through the process, and, you know, various people fell by the wayside and all this sort of stuff. And Bain was still there, Bain Capital. We've got to make sure it's clear it's Bain Capital, not Bain Consulting, but Bain Capital. They were there right through to the end, and they were determined to get Bain the buyers. And, you know, there was a lot of discussion very close to the time of the sale when Mr. Strawbridge at Deloitte was determined that Bain was going to be the buyer, and actually didn't take the bondholders' offer to the creditors for some reason. Now, apparently he said that he didn't have to. He only had to take what he thought was the best deal. But was the Bain Capital deal the best deal? Or maybe could the bondholders' deal have been okay? What do you think?
Look, it was an unusual process, and you know, the shortlisted bidders were unusual, right? I mean, I think a lot of people thought Brookfield might have been one of the stronger bidders before the shortlisting, but then they didn't make the shortlisting cut. And then I think that the other local operation of Ben Gray's private equity firm were a long-term mooted owner of them. So I think that, you know, it didn't seem the logical choice. I mean, private equity doesn't always have the kind of best reputation as the long-term oriented investment. And so I think there were issues, but I think that it was clear that Deloitte wanted them.
Yeah.
Now, whether that was because Deloitte were incentivized by Bain, I'm not certain, but I think you're right. And then, look, the bondholders wanted to recapitalise the firm and see it listed on the stock exchange. And one of those was connected to Temasek, which is the Singaporean Sovereign Wealth Fund. And
Singapore
they are the
government,
major shareholder of Singapore Airlines. And I think it just shows you how important that some of those regional airlines viewed Virgin as being, in terms of just keeping Qantas a little bit off balance and being able to have an offering that might be competing.
Yeah, it's all very interesting scenarios going on at the moment, because if you think about the importance of Qantas, you know, and digressing for a second, I mean, Alwyn-Jones closed down Qantas International basically and said it won't operate until July 2021. And yet now we have Qatar is the largest single operator into Australia, followed by, I think it's Etihad, Emirates, Air New Zealand, and so on, and China Southern. And Qantas and Virgin Australia flights aren't even flying. Now, I know it's a very low number, but, you know, it's all very interesting stuff. And what will happen when the COVID scenario is sort of becoming resolved, and will the travel community and the travel agencies stick with the people that were loyal to them? In other words, the overseas carriers will be interesting to see. But we've got this scenario, okay? So Paul Scurrah has been sitting there, taken the company, and I've worked in major consulting and with big four companies and so on. It's a tough world in that world. And he's nursed the whole thing through. He's dealt with the unions, an absolute nightmare, potential nightmare scenario. Lots of promises from Bain. We won't get rid of any staff. We'll keep things going. It's all going to be the same. And then he gets to the party. He's got the invitation in his hand, right, or to the wedding. He's got it there. He gets to the door, and then he's not let in. Isn't that a frightening scenario?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I think Paul Scurrah has been a real asset to them during this time. You know, I think he's provided enormous kind of goodwill in working through some complex negotiations. I think the unions have had to face that there's going to be job losses and there's going to be redundancies and some kind of downsizing. But I think this looks a little bit, it looks a bit preordained by Bain that this was the plan all along. Yeah. Obviously, COVID gives them, you know, the opportunity to justify all sorts of pivoting in their strategy, but it looks a bit pre-planned.
Well, especially when we consider, and you know, we've spoken about this, and a lot of people have spoken about it, that Jane Herdlicka was actually waiting in the wings. And, you know, a lot of things happened so that the step in didn't happen maybe as soon as possible. Who knows? But she's been sitting there for a while. She was waiting there as an advisor. Reportedly asked not to attend some meetings with the unions because her attitude or approach was not conducive, it's as reported, to sorting out the deal with the unions. But there we have Paul now, literally having to justify himself over the last few days, saying, no, I'm not going, I'm not going, I'm not going. But in actual fact, he was then gone. And does it suggest to you that Bain are still looking to slash costs, because that's what Jane Herdlicka does. That's what she did at Jetstar. They want to improve the balance sheet because people forget sometimes that the business is there to maximize shareholder investment. It's not there to run an airline. None of these businesses are, right? At the end of the day, it's to maximize the shareholder investment, get the balance sheet sorted, keep the costs as low as possible, and then get out via listing or making a quick sale. As described, a classic pump and dump strategy. Do you think that's what will happen?
Look, I think that is very much what they hope to do. I think it's a clear signal that they're going to play, you know, hard line in terms of screwing the cost base down. And, you know, private equity firms are not often long-term owners. The classic play in Australia has been listing and, you know, exiting with, you know, a quick make of money. I think that's very much their intention, but it's going to be interesting to see whether there's a willingness on Australian kind of super funds and institutional investors, and whether there's any appetite for Virgin Australia shares if they were to list. At the same time, it makes me feel that corporate Australia is a little bit too forgiving that Richard Branson has reappeared as a 5% minor shareholder.
For nothing.
Well, he didn't pay any of the cost of its failure, which was all borne by the bondholders, employees and the like, and yet he returns to continue as a minor shareholder and will likely still be receiving branding and licensing royalties. And, you know, that feels wrong.
Well, I'm sure it doesn't feel right to the people that invested money in Virgin Australia in the first place and lost their money effectively. So talking about price wars now and so on. So we've got Qantas, okay, doing whatever they're doing. And personally and professionally, I don't agree with the shutting down international, you know, and effectively shutting down domestic as well, because there's still a lot of business to be done in Australia. I know Alwyn-Jones has been very vociferous about opening up the borders and so on, but he gave a message, which was clearly a political message, that he was, you know, effectively kowtowing in a sense to the government, saying, right, I'm shutting international, I'm reducing services, I'm getting rid of loads of people. Very often, I'm not saying this is the case with Qantas, but companies, large companies like this, take advantage of situations like this to actually divest loads of stuff. But we've got Virgin, without any question now, I'm pretty certain this is the case, and I know you are, is heading down the low-cost path, the LCC path. This is Jane Herdlicker's strength, okay? So where's the competition going to be? Is it going to be with Qantas, the full-service carrier? I don't think they're going to be able to provide the service to compete with Qantas. So where's it going to be? It's with Jetstar. Deep pockets. Yep. Is it going to end successfully, or are we going to have a repeat of the Australian aviation history story once again?
Well, I'm inclined to think that it is setting itself up to compete with Jetstar, and that all the signals are it's going down the lowest cost route, even if its PR campaign wants to suggest otherwise and soften the blow of this kind of transition in CEO. Mm. And I think it is hard to see this being successful because, you know, this, you know, it seems ironic to me that this was part of Virgin's history previously that didn't solely, but did contribute to Ansett going out of business. Mm. And look, I mean, Rex have emerged as quite a successful operation in their own way. And they are signalling that they're going to look to compete on some of the major capital city routes as well. So, you know, I'm not convinced this is the sustainable path. No.
And I think also Alliance Airlines as well is saying they're going to be competing on some of the major routes as well. So that's quite interesting too. And there's also an ownership issue there as well. But look, I think it's amazing going forward. And I'm sure, Dr. Staples, that your students in your School of Management at RMIT, where you're a senior lecturer, must have some very interesting discussions with you about all this. Because what's better for a student than to have something contemporary and happening right in their face? Because, you know, corporate Australia maybe isn't the nicest place to do business. I'm sure it's a lot worse in corporate USA and probably corporate Britain and corporate Europe. But I definitely think this is a scenario we need to watch with absolute interest. Thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. Most certainly we'll come back in a little while and have another chat to see what actually ensues out of this corporate pot, or the mix, if you like, of what's happening at Virgin. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you, John. Lovely to talk.